Welcome to the Dr. Broadway Podcast, the musical theater history podcast where a couple of doctors sit around and talk about Broadway. I'm your co-host, Dr. Kristin Stultz Pressley, joined as always by Dr. Tracey Brent-Chessum. Tracey, we're still in our seminar series, so tell us about today's very unique topic of discussion.
So today we get to talk to the very special guest, Bway Joseph, who is the principal of Bway Joseph Consulting, a leader in innovating solutions for learning in a digital age, and the co-founder of the Games for Change Festival. So he's also an author, and his new book is what we get to discuss today. It's called Matching Minds with Sondheim. So I have mine with all of my flags, and I've been reading over the last week, and I've been having a lovely time learning about a very different side of one of our favorite composers. So
that's right. So welcome, Bway Joseph, author of Matching Minds with Sondheim, the puzzles and games of the Broadway legend. Now,
thank you for that wonderful, sorry, I need to pause a moment and say thank you. Thank you for that wonderful and warm introduction, Tracey and Kristin. It's such a pleasure to be here. I am not a doctor, but I'm a son and a grandson.
There you go.
Perfect. It counts. We'll count it. We'll count it. Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you for the work that you did. I've already told you off mic, you approached this work very differently than Tracey and I would as theater historians, and we both, I think, came away with a very unique perspective on the life of a guy that we thought that we knew, but you introduced us to a whole other side of him. And so I wonder, tell us, Bway, where you came up with this idea of, and if most musical theater lovers know that Stephen Sondheim was a huge fan of puzzles and games. In fact, he even said after the flop of, was it Merrily We Roll Along, he was going to quit. And then his next show was Sunday in the Park with George. He was going to quit and become a game designer. So very much a fan of those. Tell us, though, where you came at this idea of looking at the work of Stephen Sondheim through his love of games and puzzles.
Absolutely. But first, I want to say I really enjoy your podcast that the two of you make. And so I need to ask, unless I missed one, is this the first Sondheim episode? And if so, what took so long?
That's a very fair question. Okay, so in response to that, we have been very specific in the order that we've gone into our deep dives. I can't think of another Sondheim show that we've done.
We haven't done one.
No,
we haven't done one because none of them have been on tour.
That's right. They're not on tour. We've only done deep dives into the shows that are currently on tour. So
they're in the next season. They're already programmed. So
they're coming up. But Bway, you get the distinction of being our very first Stephen Sondheim guest.
Oh, that's thrilling. And that also means all Sondheim's on the table. Because when we're talking about his puzzles and games, we're talking about something that he was engaged with his entire life, from when he was a teenager until he passed away. And it's hard to go to a Sondheim production and listen to his music without noticing how his love of puzzles and games were intimately connected to how he constructed his music and how he wrote his lyrics. Nothing of which I knew about when I started. So to go back to your question, how did I get here? So I live in New York City. I'm in New York City right now. I grew up on Long Island. I grew up going to Broadway. My parents would take me, and as an adult, I would get my playbills. I have my closet in the other room full of my 12 books, full of all my shows. Love my Broadway. Did not like Sondheim. I mean, I didn't hate Sondheim. I just didn't know who he was growing up. Yeah. It was kind of dark and mature and adult. And then I saw Passion in previews, which was kind of not working. I love it now. I love what they've done with it, but wasn't working yet. Yeah. But I started noticing this guy was doing some really interesting things. I saw Assassins and said, okay, I like where this is going. And so in the 90s and into the noughts, I started exploring all of his shows. I fell in love with Merrily We Roll Along, just the soundtrack, and started watching different productions of it as people were constantly iterating it, trying to figure out how to make the show work right. And that became a really fun process to not just enjoy a show, but enjoy the process of people trying to bring a show to the place that it was waiting to get to, right? Which we saw just a few years ago, and now last December in the Pro Shot. From the recent Broadway production that was so successful. And so having that love of Sondheim as a fan kept me around his shows. I'd go to his shows. I'd listen to him talk about his shows. And I had no idea that there was any connection with the rest of my life, which I do many things, but one of them is designing games. I'm a founder of Games for Change, as you mentioned earlier, Tracey, which is an organization now 23 years old, maybe 24. That was one of the first ones to really bring people together to look at in a contemporary way how games could do more than just entertain. How could they teach? How could they create social change? How can they help improve people's health? And so on. And so in that space, working with young people in after-school settings, working at Girl Scouts of the United States of America, and working at museums like the American Museum of Natural History, I love creating games on all sorts of topics. And by doing that, I got to meet really incredible gaming academics, ludologists, people who study play in Wisconsin and California and New York City. And it introduced me to how people can think really hard about play. And so having that orientation, when I saw what you mentioned, Kristin, in the oral history of Sunday in the Park with George, James Lapine is interviewing Stephen Sondheim. And in it, he says not only did he want to leave musical theater because he was so hurt by the critical response to Merrily We Roll Along, but specifically go into video game design. Yeah. This is the early 80s. This isn't now.
I loved that part. I absolutely loved that part. It's funny because, doing the research that I do, and I was in the same archives you were, and a couple years ago, our mutual friend between all of us, Doug Reside, I was at the Billy Rose, and I was
New York City.
Yep. I was in there looking at all of I think it was Hal Prince's papers, and all of this correspondence is coming in like after the first two shows, the first two previews of Merrily We Roll Along, and it was heartbreaking. Like the stuff that the letters that are like, I love your work. I have been so amazed by your, your talent, but I always buy it for the very first week, and I have no idea what is going on in this show, and I need you to give me my money back. And it was like, oh, I mean, it was like this old man writing to them, being like, please give me my money back. I was like, oh, ouch. That combined with like the critics being like, this is terrible. I was like, oh, I would cry too. I would go do video games. Well, and I don't play video games. So,
and speaking of the video game thing, like, what shocked me when I read your book was, it was just this mental image of Stephen Sondheim playing Atari. You talk about Sondheim and John Weidman playing Atari together. And that was just a mental image that was, I always imagined puzzles and games. I'm thinking, the New York Times crossword puzzles. I'm thinking puzzle boxes, something very erudite. But video games, it blew me away that Stephen Sondheim was into those.
And for me to think about myself being 8, 9, 10 years old, loving my Atari games in my living room, and now as an adult looking back, thinking at exactly the same time, John Weidman is over at Stephen Sondheim's house with a box of Atari games. Now, when I interviewed John Weidman, he said two important things to help us understand how to think about what you just described, Kristin. It seems crazy that not only he would be playing these games, they're not great games. It was the beginning of, right? And so
Frogger.
what John...
Right.
What's that?
Frogger.
Frogger, right?
It was
They're
Frogger.
interesting games. And so what John Wyman said was two things. He brought over a few games to Sondheim's house, and Sondheim essentially was like, hey, don't worry about it, because he had a box with all the games that were out, right? So that's the first thing. He's being comprehensive and a collector, which he often was around puzzles and games. And the second thing was that John Wyman said Sondheim didn't want to play them because they were good. They would pop it in, learn how it worked, and move on to the next one. Sondheim was just interested in the game design. Like, oh, what are people doing in this new medium? I love games. Let me see what games look like in this new form. Yeah. And they were playing them to explore them. And it engaged that part of his mind. When he was a teenager and he first started getting into board games, he described once playing a different board game every day. He was playing them to understand the game mechanics. He was learning them. And he was doing the same thing with the Atari. After he played those sessions with John Weidman, who knows if he ever played again.
Right. Yeah. Right. But you're absolutely right to see the parallels between the way that he understood those game mechanics and the way that he understood wordplay, right? He could, that is so evident, not only in his lyrics, but also in his music.
That's right. And so you asked how this all started. I read that quote. I read that he wanted to go into video game design momentarily. It passed, luckily for all of us who love Sunday in the Park with George. But the idea didn't pass for me. I thought, how did my two worlds of being a Sondheim fan and being a game designer crash and then pull apart? And I wanted to hold them together. I wanted to know, what was it Stephen Sondheim would have done if he went into game design? And what I was shocked to find is that it wasn't a what if. He was designing games his whole life. Treasure hunts, parlor games, board games. his work on crosswords, specifically cryptic crosswords, changed puzzles in America. And then later, he was an escape room evangelist and loved gifting elaborate jigsaw puzzles and loved collecting puzzle boxes. That's a pretty wide range of games and puzzles. And we have decades and decades of objects that he created and designed.
You know what?
Go ahead, Tracy. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just was like blown away because I was reading this and I was like, well, I always knew that he liked games, mostly because people that, acquaintances, friends that had been to his house were like, there's games everywhere. They're everywhere. And I was like, what do you mean they're everywhere? It just kind of went right over my head. And then you look in the book and he's using them in his decorating. He has them on the walls. He's got vintage games all over the walls and it's like, everywhere. And then he's got an entire game room. And then and you're like, that's interesting. He's like, no, it's puzzles. It's all how his brain works. It makes perfect sense when you get there. And I was like, it really does. But if you've not been to his house, if you didn't see those pictures, I didn't have quite the conception of how kind of all encompassing this was for him. So
when Stephen Sondheim moved into the home that he had in Manhattan until he passed, I think it was around 1960, with the money he earned from Gypsy, an acquaintance of his, possibly a girlfriend, gifted him his first antique board. And when I say board, it's a board from a board game. He wasn't given it to play. It was given to him framed to put on the wall. And once he saw that, he said, oh, that's cool. I don't have a lot of stuff on my wall. I don't have a lot of money. I like the way they look. They look neat. And so he went back to the store where the first one had been acquired, and that began his collecting. And as he often said, and they weren't very expensive, right? And even though they would sell for thousands of dollars at the Doyle auction after he passed away.
Yes.
Right? And they are quite beautiful to look at. And so the press, whenever they came to visit his home, would always talk about how unusual it was to see these walls decorated. And not only decorated with board games, they were floor to ceiling, one end to the other. You might see 20 of them in a room. And you can see photos from his house over the decades, and you see certain ones moving around. I know one that's been in at least 4 locations. And so it wasn't just that he was like, oh, in this room, I'm going to hang up a version of Monopoly. It's like, no. This is a 1850s Game of the Goose style board game, which has maybe 50 spots with all these interesting things designed into it. And then it would be one of 19, or 20 that would be all in a room covering the area. So when friends would go in, like you're saying, Tracy, it was hard not to be overwhelmed by just seeing those. And of course, those were ones he didn't play, not only because they hung on the wall, but they are boring to play. You roll the die and you move a few spots. And he'd be the first one to say that. And it was one of the many facets of his interest in games. And that was one that was easiest to see and got reported the most. And yet the most interesting stuff was what he created. And that almost no one saw.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is where I say I think it's going to take us in a different track. But for those of us, I want to start kind of at the beginning with Sondheim's love for puzzles, because I say we all know that, but maybe there's somebody, this is brand new information to them. So can you talk to us about, I know you mentioned that as a child he would play board games and try to understand the mechanics of it. And in the book, you give the quote, a good puzzle brings order out of chaos, and you connect Sondheim's interest in games to his parents' divorce and maybe a striving for control after his parents' divorce. So I wonder if you can tell us just historically in his life, when did this love for games present itself?
Great question. First, I want to say, if you are a listener right now and you're thinking, why did I not know this? Is something wrong with me? There's nothing wrong with you.
No, exactly. That's what I wanted to clarify. One
of my favorite comments after a talk was someone saying, oh, this all makes so much more sense now. It's for many people, it's the missing piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. Sure.
It was something that is out there, but only the tip of the iceberg. And it took me years of research and interviewing over 60 hours of people, and then even speaking over to about 120 people, some by email, to really speak with those who were there to understand what was going on and to see the things that were usually just for friends, families, coworkers, and beyond that was really ephemera that most people would have thrown away in another context, but it was Stephen Sondheim, so they would stick it in a drawer, right?
Yeah.
So Sondheim, as described in the late 90s autobiography by Meryl Seacrest, had this notion, and he says when he's speaking with Ms. Seacrest that he had just had this idea recently, that when his parents got divorced, when he was, I think, 11, it brought chaos into his life in a way that he was not prepared for, hadn't expected, and wasn't supported to actually deal with. And as a result, he loved things that gave him order. That's when he said he started playing piano. That's when he was sent to military academy, which he enjoyed. He loved the order that it came with. And that's when he started studying games. And all of those were ways, music, an ordered environment, game design and puzzle design became ways for him, as he would say later on in that phrase you just said, order out of chaos. Yeah. Sometimes he would say that's what art is, but he would also apply it to other things, like why he loved jigsaw puzzles. As he would say, you take a box of pieces, you dump them on the table, it's chaos, you put them together, you have order. And it's that moment when order appears, when you have that moment of awe, that moment of this kind of like almost like divine moment where everything comes together, that you feel that thing that someone can design for you. And that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to design them. So when he was a teenager, he started designing word puzzles. There was a column called Puns and Anagrams that was in the New York Times that had kind of punny style questions that you might reflect as being somewhat coming from a cryptic crossword background. So it prepared him for that later in his life. And he actually submitted one to the New York Times, and it was rejected. He also came up with the idea for a board game, which he also submitted to a major publisher, also rejected. But you can see him before he's even left his home, which he did when he was 16, to go to college at Williams. Before that age of 16, writing puzzles and submitting them to be seen by the public, creating board games meant to be published to maybe create a revenue for him and be played by others. This interest in engaging others through not just what turned out to be musical theater for his life's work, but also through how he can create moments of clarity through puzzles and through games, moments of connection, began in earnest. And when he started going deeper into musical theater, once he was in his 20s, working on West Side Story, working on Gypsy, working on his own pieces, he didn't stop designing puzzles. He didn't stop designing games. He just stopped trying to put them out into the world in a public way. He would design board games for Hal Prince, for Leonard Bernstein. He would design puzzles for friends, treasure hunts. And it really wasn't until 1968 that he had an opportunity to go public with it, as it were. I think you all know where I'm going, right?
Yeah.
1968, new magazine appears. It's called New York Magazine, and he was hired as their first puzzle editor. That, to most Sondheim fans, is a what moment? He was friends with Gloria Steinem, and Gloria Steinem was friends with the publisher, and Gloria Steinem knew he loved doing the really tricky British crosswords called cryptic crosswords, and he decided to translate them for an American audience.
Wow.
They weren't new in America, but they were still as inaccessible as they were for any American picking up a British one. He figured out how to make them accessible to an American audience. And in the next just under a year and a half, he created 42 of what Will Shortz described to me as the hardest puzzles in the English language. It could take a week, a month to solve one of them, and he's creating them once a week. It's pretty remarkable.
While at the same time writing Company, right? Because Company came out in 1970. So these would have been happening on parallel tracks.
So when he started doing it weekly, he then pushed back to eventually every 3 weeks. Okay. And then he stopped because he said he has to go work on Company. And of course, when he's working on Company, he's also working on Follies, which came out the year after.
Yeah, that's right.
What an incredible mind to be able to tackle so many of these things. But when he left it, he left behind someone who he had trained. Richard Maltby Jr.
Oh my gosh.
Fellow lyricist.
Yeah, that makes sense, though. That makes perfect
sense. Just this January, finished his 50 years of creating monthly cryptic crosswords.
I missed that.
Trained by Stephen Sondheim. You're not alone. That's why I wrote the book. There's just so much out there.
Yes. Well, okay. So that brings me to my next question. You alluded to the way that you had, I think you said 60 hours of interviews and email conversations with people who had been a part of this orbit, of Stephen Sondheim's orbit. This is a really unique take, and it required some very niche research. And I wonder, as a researcher myself, how did you go about finding this information? Because it's not necessarily stuff that would otherwise be held in an archive somewhere, right?
That's right. There are things that I could find in an archive and things that would never be in an archive.
Right.
I mean, really, when you take on a project, especially with someone as iconic as Stephen Sondheim, you have to find the thin slice and own it. Now, I wasn't looking for that thin slice. I was just amazed by the fact that Stephen Sondheim, the composer, the lyricist, and Stephen Sondheim, the game designer, was somehow the same person. And wanting to get to the bottom of that interested me. And the more I dug into it, the more I saw how niche it was, but also how deep it was. So the first part was easy. Like we said, dug reside, New York Public Library for the Performing Arts. What do they have? What do they have at Indiana University? What do they have at Yale? Where Meryl Seacrest's audio files are from all of her interviews with Sondheim and his friends in the 1990s. What do they have in the files of other people at the Library of Congress? So that was a bit of work of getting access to those and seeing them. And this is the big second year of the pandemic, right? So it's like, what
I was going to ask you, what's your time frame? How long did this take?
So he died in November 2021, and I started working on it in April 2022.
Okay.
To give you a sense of the timing, right? So I wouldn't say that was all easy, but that was kind of, a logical next step. Just go to the next one and say, who knows where something is, right?
Yeah.
The challenges, as you talked about, was getting to talk to people. Because since we're talking about ephemera, really what we're looking at is people's memories. Who was there? Who played his murder game in the 1960s? Who played the treasure hunt that he designed in 1973 for the cast of A Little Night Music, right? Who went to the American Museum of Natural History in 2011 and did the dinosaur-themed treasure hunt? On and on. And so every time I would talk with someone, to jump to the end, I would say, who else should I talk to and what am I missing?
Yeah, smart.
And that then opened the door for me. So once I got a few people who were willing to talk to me and kind of build that trust and build that legitimacy, why should they talk to me? Then I could say, oh, so-and-so recommended I contact you. And they usually said the same thing. They said, I'm sorry, you're asking me what I did 60 years ago on a particular night? I don't think I can remember anything, right?
Yes.
And then as soon as we started talking, it was like the floodgates had opened up. And I could, sometimes they didn't want to stop. They were enjoying their friend coming back to life. Not the friend who was just making music, but the friend they loved playing with and who they missed.
Well, I think it was Maltby that you mentioned that was so excited to talk about, right? Wasn't he the one, or was it Weidman?
Oh, there were so many. It wasn't one
they were
person.
just so excited to have a chance to have, to recall this, to talk about it. And, it was an enormous amount of work, I know, for you, but it also had to be unbelievably gratifying to be able to do the work.
Well, it's an honor when people, honor when people are telling you memories that are deeply emotional for them, both exciting because you can see how excited they are, and sometimes sad because they missed him. He'd passed away. It was under a year. And to be the repository of those stories creates a responsibility for me as a writer. Right. And I experienced that with my first book because I was also interviewing people around a topic of something that was passing. In this case, something much more esoteric, old-fashioned seltzer siphon bottling, right? Yeah. But it was the same spot I was in. People were telling me these stories, and I was going to be the repository of them. And what was I going to do with them? So I had to not only write the book, I had to write the book because I now had these stories and I had to figure out how to tell their story in a way that honored them, honored Stephen Sondheim, and would honor the reader as someone who I was going to be bringing into this space in many ways for the first time.
So where are you going to, where are you archiving all of this information for those of us who are scholars and may want to come back to that in the years to come, other than your book?
So I pushed really hard to make sure that everything in the book is documented. And you can look at an extensive index in the back that shows you where to find things in the book. And then citations that tell you where you can find those things yourself. I list all the research institutions that I go to, and I thank everyone I spoke with. So a lot of things that I accessed have been available for years for anyone who wants to find, and now you can go too, for example. So there's that. And then there's the fact that I have at least 2 drawers. Let's just say it's full of stuff.
Yeah.
Now, this is stuff that people would send me. They would say, oh, you're writing about this? Here, I'll send this to you. I have this thing that I was at. Or from the Doyle auction, many of his items were sold in large lots by people who weren't ready to take a large lot and were happy to share things with others. And they sent me things. So I have all these objects, and I would love for them to be available publicly someday. Okay. Is there going to be a Stephen Sondheim museum someday? If so, I'd love for it to go there. Until then, there's all sorts of other institutions where things can go. However, even though that future date hasn't arrived, I have been giving items that other people gave me to some institutions. The New York Public Library, the Library of Congress, and the Strong Museum all have items from the 2011 A Little Jurassic Treasure Hunt that Stephen Sondheim designed at the American Museum of Natural History. Oh, wait, they have a copy too. So there's 4 locations where you can go and see all the clues, not the answers, but the clues that he designed for that night for 300 people. That was a fundraiser.
That's amazing.
It really is. And I wonder, as you're talking about all of the people that you interviewed who were so excited to talk about their friend and their experiences with him, particularly as he had just recently died. And so it was just a cathartic for them to be able to talk about their experiences with him. But I wonder, your publisher Bloomsbury, I wonder when you sent this proposal to them, what was their response? Obviously they published the book, but I'm just curious. Yeah, right. I'm just curious about the publishing process.
So am I right that you published Kristin through Methuen? I don't know how to pronounce it.
Which is
who was
an
under
imprint
Bloomsbury as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you went through an imprint. I originally was with an imprint. It was Applause. And
I was with Applause for my first book about Dorothy Fields.
Nice.
Yeah.
So Applause is no more. It's now just Bloomsbury. So your publisher was able to keep their name as an imprint. Mine was not. So by the time they accepted, to the time it was finalized and went to publication, my imprint disappeared. But originally Applause was an imprint that I thought was perfect. Yes. It was someone who was writing for people who knew musical theater, cared about thinking about it, and yet, as with most of the publishers we pitched it to, they said, is this a book for theater people or is it a book for puzzle people? And they couldn't figure out which one it was. And my editor, Chris Chappell, who's the one who fought for it under Applause, he understood it wasn't or, it was yes and.
Right.
It's where the two overlap. Right. And it welcomes people in who don't know anything about puzzles or games and teaches them what they need to know to see Stephen Sondheim's work in a new way. And it brings in people who know nothing about Stephen Sondheim, just this guy who is famous, but care about puzzles and games and can see how this brilliant mind who created some of the most important lyrics and music of the last century also applied that thinking in the space of puzzles and games. And if you care about neither, come on in. It's a new way to look at someone's life, a ludological perspective, looking at someone's life from how they played versus what they made, in this case, in musical theater. And so he was able to see what other people weren't able to see. But that's how often it is with a unique property, right? It was kind of an unusual beast. What is this thing? And it came out October 2nd of 2025. And by the end of January 2026, we were entering our fourth printing.
Oh, awesome. My word. Well, when you told me that Bloomsbury stuck with it, when you started with Applause, which I published my Dorothy Fields book with Applause in 2021. So I was with them prior to the transition to Bloomsbury. But when you told me that Bloomsbury still went with it instead of, so often when these mergers happen, any projects that are coming down the trail kind of get left behind in the transition. But the fact that they continued on with the project tells me that they knew that it was a great project.
Well, I'm very grateful to them, especially Chris. Yeah. I'm now going to tell you something you won't expect, because I'm going to take your last two questions and combine them.
Oh, please, go for it.
One of the first people I reached out to when I first started was Paul Salsini. I don't know if you know his name. He was the founder of the Sondheim Review in the 1990s. It was a regular magazine in America that you could get and learn all about Stephen Sondheim. And they would coordinate with him as well. Paul opened the door for me to many, many people. And Paul's book came out that fall. It's a book about his relationship with Stephen Sondheim. And I interviewed him, I think, in June of 2022. And he asked me if I would blurb the book. And I was like, Paul, why do you want me to blurb the book? I am just beginning research on mine. But he was like, no, I really like what you're doing. And so when his book came out in October, on the back cover, it says a quote, and it says, from Barry Joseph, author of, I don't know if it said Matching Minds with Sondheim, but something close to it. As a result, that December, the New York Times wrote a piece on all of the new books coming out about Stephen Sondheim.
And they put it on there. Oh my gosh.
And they included it. Now, originally the reporter said, okay, well, who's your agent? I said, oh, I don't have an agent yet. Okay, but who's your publisher? When's it coming out? I said, I don't have a publisher yet. And they said, I'm sorry, we can't mention you in the New York Times. I said, oh, that's fine. I get it. He called me back the next day and said, I'm sorry, we got to put it in. This is crazy. I love what you're doing. And so within 9 months of having the idea, I spoke with Paul, who has since passed away. But during his time, he connected me with so many people for whom I'm so grateful. And because he asked me to blurb his book, it was in the New York Times within 9 months of having the idea, which is like unheard of.
Yeah, that's
and that's just not the way academic publishing works. So this is just hilarious to listen to. And I think that's one of the things that I really, really liked while I was reading the book is that it does do a beautiful job, Barry, of like moving seamlessly between the music master and the Puzzle Master, and kind of going back and forth and back and forth. And so often I found myself being like, and my brain is starting to explode. And then the musical theater would come back and be like, I got it now. I'm back with you. I understand where I'm going. So it was a fun read, and it was a good workout for my brain. So
and I would say to you, Barry, you come at this like we've already said, you're not a theater historian like we are, but it holds up. It holds muster with theater historians. Does. Like the work feels very, very thorough. It feels very, you can tell you did the work, and it's really, really
very
well done.
Well researched.
Thank you both. I really appreciate that.
Yes.
I do not have a doctorate, but I do have a master's. I got my master's in cultural studies at NYU many years ago. And it is that training that taught me how to do the research and value the research and cite it for others to follow the trail. How the work you do is building on the work done before you, and you're creating steps for the future. And especially when I dig into something that gets talked about and referenced, so much so that now when I read it, before my book came out, I knew what anecdote they were getting it from and what they were changing over time to get to come in and say, okay, this is now the foundation for all conversations about this moving forward. If you want to talk about his movie, The Last of Sheila, you can't do that without reading what I wrote in the book. If you want to talk about his murder game, the 1960s, you can't do that without reading my book. Not because I'm so great, but because I'm the first one to have taken the time to do that research, talk to the people, look at the material, which other people could have done. I only did it because that's my interest. It brings the two together. And now that I've done it, it's there moving for others to pull from. And I'm so appreciative of you, but give me such nice compliments. Thank you.
Oh, and I mean it truly. Well, just as we wrap up our time together, I have two other questions for you. Tracey, you may have more, but I just have two. One is, what was the most interesting thing that you learned about Stephen Sondheim through your study? Like the one that just knocked your socks off?
I never understood, just from his music, how brilliant he was. I knew he was brilliant, but if you pushed me a few years ago, I probably would have said, yes, but if someone else was in that same situation, maybe they would have learned those skills and done those things as well. I came to completely reevaluate how I understand how human beings develop and what their minds are capable of. I do not think the way he thinks, and there's nothing that could have ever happened in my life to let me think that way. And I also think differently from him, and I value that. And so I'm valuing his brilliance, not only being superior in some ways, because he could do things I couldn't do, but just the fact that we all have different ways of thinking. And I appreciate that very much. And when I look at how he constructed something like his cryptic crosswords, and I watch other people today solving them, and it's so inaccessible to me, that's a beautiful thing to me about how humans work and how diverse we are.
Yeah. Yes.
And then
I look at those things and run. I'm like, no. I'm like, okay, that'll just, and it'll bug me because I can't figure it out. And then it's like, so I just stay away. That's my problem.
And then the one final question that I would ask, and again, Tracey, you may have another question or two that you'd like to ask, but I know from writing a biography of Dorothy Fields that you wish that you could talk to the person themselves, right? And so I wonder if you could have a conversation with Stephen Sondheim, what would you most want to ask him? And it doesn't have to be one question. Maybe there's a couple of questions that you would put at the top of your list of questions to ask Stephen Sondheim.
What I would most want to know from him is how he understood his identity as someone who designed puzzles and games. There's all sorts of things that people do in their lives, but it doesn't mean they identify as one who does that. It might be a thing they see as outside themselves that they go to every once in a while. So were games and puzzles a distraction from him that let him procrastinate from doing what he was supposed to be doing, writing his songs and lyrics? Were they his mental exercise to prepare him to write those songs and write those lyrics? Or were they allowing him to express something he could not express in the songs and letting him have a different vehicle for them? And if the economics were reversed, if musical theater didn't pay, or at least pay as much as he got, he was successful.
Yes, well.
And instead it was puzzles and games, would he have not only done that, would he have preferred to have done that? And so you hear him talk in his interviews about minimizing in some ways what he did in puzzles and games.
Yeah.
When it's about puzzles and games, because it's Games Magazine, for example, which he did in the 80s and in the 2020s, then he's proudly talking about what he did, and he's almost bragging And in fact, he even said in the last appearance in Games Magazine, I virtually introduced Cryptic Crossroads to America. He's proud of that. But that pride is not what you see most of the time. He's usually talking with people who want to talk about the music and lyrics, and he's going to kind of beat them to the punch and downplay what he did, or the opposite. He does want to talk about his puzzles and games, and the interviewer doesn't. And that was some of the best stuff I found, because there were stuff left on the cutting room floor that wasn't published, which includes Meryl Seacrest's work. So that, to me, is what I'd most want to know, because all I'm left to do is kind of guess. What was his relationship with his puzzles and games, and what did they mean to him?
Yeah, I thought
He's left us with more puzzles. I'm sorry, Tracy.
No, I just thought it was really interesting. That seems to be kind of a theme. It's like, and again, he says to a reporter, "That's been overstated." Like, my relationship to games, overstated. And you're like, no, it wasn't. Like, you can already tell, like, as you're reading, you're like, no, it wasn't. What are you saying that for? But then he knows who he's talking to, That's
right. And he's shaping that. He's shaping his image. But what he thinks people want to see about him. Now,
he went on TV game shows. Like, come on. Like,
Password, which you can see on YouTube.
I just love that. And I was like, I had no idea. And I was like, wait a minute. I have done so much stuff on Stephen Sondheim. You'd think that I would. No, it doesn't come up anywhere. But yet he becomes such a part of this different kind of cultural zeitgeist that, most of the time as theater historians, we would never, ever have access to otherwise. So
that's what I think is such a strength of this book, is that, we think we know it all about this great legend of musical theater. And yet you have just spent, several hundred pages telling us something that we didn't know. And that, when you can find a project like that, that is a gift from straight above, that is something that not many of us get to have. And so it's just an unbelievable treasure for any fan of musical theater or puzzles and games or just interesting individuals.
Thank you, Kristin. It's definitely felt like a gift to me to get to work on it. And now the book is out, it's a gift that keeps on giving. I have my Instagram channel, Matching Minds with Sondheim, and I'm constantly posting things that blow my mind that people are still sending me. Yeah. A month ago, we had the first photo that I've ever seen of Stephen Sondheim playing a video game, which he did with a friend, and the friend sent me the photo, but had never spoken about his relationship with Sondheim before.
Unbelievable.
He used to fly over from LA to play Myst, for example. I give my speaking tour for my book, which is sometimes a workshop on how to design games the way Stephen Sondheim designed games. Maybe it's about making treasure hunts. Maybe I'm going deep into how do you look at Stephen Sondheim's songs in a new way. I have all these different ways of presenting it and engaging people in person. And I love wherever people are coming from, they're excited by the project. I even did a traveling museum, not traveling. I did a pop-up museum expo that was at the Drama Bookshop in New York City that ran for just over a month. That was super fun. I had 2 cases and I had a blast putting that together. And who knows what's going to be next, but I can tell it. This was a gift for me to work on it, and I keep looking for new opportunities to put it out into the world.
That's
so I appreciate you bringing me on. Oh, hello, and my podcast.
Yes, tell us about your podcast.
So we talked about the interviews. About half of those interviews gave me permission to use them in other mediums to promote the book and promote the ideas. And so you can read and hear their stories in my book, and you can listen to their voices in my podcast. And I don't just play their clips from their interviews. I also bring in people who I would not have brought into the book because they didn't know Stephen Sondheim, but they have expertise on the topic. They know escape rooms. They know board games. They know crossword puzzles. And together we re-listen to the audio from the book, and then they comment on them. So I just launched the topic that scared me the most, Tracy. It was the crossword episode.
Oh, gosh.
There's a reason why it was episode 22. I really pushed it back in the line. And I have about another 10 or so that I'll be doing. So you can pick any topic you want, or you can start from the beginning and just dive in.
And where can people stream that?
Anywhere you go to get your podcast. All respectable places you go to get your podcast.
Yep. Excellent. Well, Barry, this has been absolutely fantastic. I have thoroughly enjoyed hearing about your project and your process, and I'm so grateful that you joined us for this episode today. I do want to let our listeners know that the book is available wherever you buy books. The podcast is available at any respectable place that you listen to podcasts. Yes. And if you want to read the book, you can find out things for yourself, like how to host your own Sondheimian treasure hunt and how to understand Sondheim's parameters for creating clues in a game and what are Sondheim's 3 principles of play. If you want to know those things, or if you just want to know more about the man himself, you need to pick this book up. Barry, thanks for joining us. We're so glad to have you.
Such a pleasure being here. Thank you both so much.
That'll do it for this episode of the Dr. Broadway podcast. Tune in for our next seminar episode, whose specific topic is still TBD, so I hope you like surprises. Our regular episodes will return in early March. Until then, connect with us via email at hello@drbroadway.com or on Instagram, YouTube, or TikTok at Dr. Bway Podcast.